We believe that some stories just have to be challenged. Not because they're forbidden, but because their claims, their imaginative claims, demand real rigor, real philosophical scrutiny.
Exactly. And this is a critique, part of our continuing inquiry into how fiction really illuminates moral truth and sometimes moral asymmetry.
Fiction, even when it's completely made up, it sort of acts as a blueprint, doesn't it?
It does. It reflects the moral architecture of reality, sometimes in very disturbing ways. So our goal here isn't just to consume the story.
Yeah.
It's active dissection. We need to understand the ideas the author is selling and then ask if those ideas actually hold up.
Right. And before we get into what is some pretty challenging material, just a quick note for you.
Uh-huh.
You are experiencing a unique two-host AI conversation. It's powered by Google's Notebook LM, which we use for deeper, more dynamic analysis.
Today, we are taking on a critical analysis of Jean Raspail's The Camp of the Saints.
A book that has been just fiercely controversial since, 1973?
That's right, and it forces this really agonizing question on the reader.
What's that?
What does a story like this claim about justice when innocence alone isn't enough to protect the innocent?
Wow. That hook really sets up our mission here today. We're applying a pretty rigorous critical framework.
We are.
We're using the Paul and Elder critical thinking model to look at bias in structure.
And we're pairing that with an intellectual ethics framework. Think Adler, the Golden Rule, even the foundational language of the U.S. preamble.
And just to be clear, our goal is critique. We're analyzing meaning and argument, but we're not going to reveal specific plot points or dialogue.
So let's get into it, the core narrative.
Okay.
The book sets up this massive allegorical premise. At its heart, it imagines a kind of final existential test for what it calls the West.
And the test is an event.
It is. The whole story is driven by the arrival of a single, overwhelming migrant armada. The book says it's about 1 million impoverished people sailing from India, heading directly for the coast of France.
It's a huge, almost biblical image.
It is.
But we need to look past the event itself and get at the fundamental truth claim that's hiding underneath all that symbolism. Because it's not just a political thriller about destabilization. The argument is, it's far more radical than that.
That's exactly right. The book's central argument is that the very ideals that Western societies claim to hold, things like universalism, compassion, egalitarian principles, that these aren't strengths, they are fatal weaknesses. The book argues that when you're confronted with a massive movement of poor, racialized outsiders, these virtues will actually destroy your society from the inside out.
It completely flips the script on the entire Western ethical tradition. And that's why the book works as a kind of invasion novel, an apocalyptic allegory.
It takes all these incredibly complex global issues, economic imbalance, the legacy of colonialism, historical poverty, and it compresses them down into one single massive symbolic event.
And that compression is maybe its most effective tool, rhetorically speaking.
It is. By collapsing all that history and economics into one terrifying spectacle, the narrative dramatizes what Raspail sees as this inevitable collapse of Western will.
So if you frame demographic change as an existential siege, a literal invasion, then survival seemingly justifies anything.
It justifies extreme exclusion, yes. The discussion just bypasses any kind of thoughtful policy and jumps straight into panic mode.
And what's so fascinating is how the book is intellectually rigged to prove its own point, which brings us right to the core ethical problem. This profound asymmetry in how people are depicted.
This is where we have to look at its violation of the Golden Rule. I mean, the text repeatedly depicts the non-white refugees in just systematically demeaning and animalizing terms.
There's that infamous figure.
The figure referred to by a slur, the turd eater, which is a deliberate mechanism designed to just strip away all human dignity.
That mechanism, that systematic refusal to grant equal moral status, that is exactly what we mean by ethical asymmetry. The Golden Rule demands that we see other people as fully equal moral subjects, regardless of their circumstances. But this book gives full humanity to one group and denies it completely to the other.
And it's staggering how it does this through narrative technique. So many of the white French characters are given this rich interiority, complexity, emotional depth.
You see their fears, their rationalizations, all their inner conflict.
Exactly. But the people on the ships,
they're monolith.
They're presented as an undifferentiated mass, a wave, a swarm, a demographic threat. Rarely as individuals, they're treated less like human beings and more like a a force of nature, a problem to be solved.
And if we zoom out and analyze that moral imagination against, say, the U.S. preamble, its commitment to justice, domestic tranquility, general welfare, the book's imagination leans so far away from expanding justice. Instead, its whole focus is on preserving a very specific, racialized order. The newcomers are just defined as being outside the scope of general welfare.
And moving from the moral claims to the narrative perspective, you can see exactly how that worldview is enforced.
How so?
The narrative voice consistently centers the fearful, besieged perspective of the white French observers. We are absolutely meant to see the Armada only through their eyes.
As an annihilating tide.
Yeah.
A pure threat.
It's a crucial design choice. The voices of the migrants, their psychological complexity, the reasons for their journey, they're almost entirely absent.
That's selective interiority. That is a classic way to manufacture bias. And if we apply that Paul and Elder critical thinking framework, you immediately see this strong egocentric and sociocentric bias at work.
Let's quickly define those because they're useful. Egocentric bias is seeing the world almost entirely through your own narrow self-interest and fears.
And sociocentric.
That's seeing the world through the narrow lens of your own group's interests. The story basically forces you to merge your empathy with the us, the insiders, so that you can only see them as a threat to our existence.
And the book goes even further. It systematically eliminates any character who might offer a more complex bridge-building perspective.
Oh, absolutely. Any character who could offer a balanced view, say an educated non-white figure or a Western liberal arguing for aid, they're all reduced to these absurd caricatures.
They're portrayed as naive or self-hating or somehow complicit in the West's downfall.
Which is what the Adlerian view would call a failure of intellectual virtue. The book stacks the deck. It refuses to fairly represent any opposing viewpoint.
So it forces the reader into this binary. Either you're firm against the threat or any compassion you feel is just. Self-destructive sentimentality. It's not principled justice.
It creates a completely closed system of logic, and that raises a really difficult question about our role as readers in processing this kind of material.
It does. Let's just pause on that idea of intellectual virtue for a moment.
Mindful moments. We want you to just pause and ask yourself, if the roles were reversed, if your own community were starving, displaced, and desperate, how would you want other, safer societies to speak about you? Would you accept being represented only as a swarm, a threat, or a disease in the stories they tell themselves?
And if you find value in applying these kinds of critical frameworks to literature, remember that Mindful Moments, our YouTube channel, offers AI book analysis, summaries, and critiques. It's a great tool for mindful literary reflection, and it's especially valuable for aspiring authors.
So let's get back to the core symbolism, because the book's power really rests on its imagery.
It does.
The central symbol is that fleet, the Armada of the Last Chance. It is brilliant, high-stakes allegory, but it's also deeply ethically problematic.
Because it compresses everything. Centuries of colonial exploitation, global inequality, all these complex migration trends.
Into a single, terrifying, quasi-biblical wave. And that condensation, that's where the propaganda lies.
By stripping away all the causes, the agency, the individuality of millions of people.
All you're left with is this terrifying spectacle. And that spectacle becomes the only justification you need for this preemptive total rejection.
If you look at the emotional reasoning through that Paul and Elder lens, the book is clearly designed to stoke fear, disgust, apocalyptic anxiety.
It is not designed to encourage careful moral reasoning.
No. The primary emotional logic is a deep, egocentric fear of loss. Loss of status, loss of culture, anxiety about demographic change. And the narrative frames this fear as the only rational response. Any other response is suicidal folly.
We have to place this in its context, too. It was written in 1973.
Right after decolonization.
Exactly. It was a time of significant cultural anxiety in France, which was grappling with debates over post-colonial migration from North and West Africa.
And the book didn't just reflect those debates, did it? It helped shape them.
It absolutely did. It crystallized a far-right narrative of an endangered white West facing a third world invasion. It gave that anxiety a story.
And that fictional frame has had a very real and dangerous legacy.
It has. Scholars have noted that its apocalyptic imagery, this idea of a final cultural replacement, has directly informed the modern Great Replacement conspiracy theory.
It's sobering to realize this isn't just a piece of fiction anymore. In recent decades, the Camp of the Saints has been cited again and again as a kind of prophetic text.
It's become a touchstone for white nationalist and nativist circles all over the world. from European far-right activists to American political operatives.
And when a story like this becomes the ideological scaffolding, when it's used to rationalize policies, its symbolic world moves out of the purely literary sphere.
It does. It normalizes exclusion and, tragically, has even been linked to the manifestos justifying political violence.
So if we just evaluate the narrative logic on its own terms, you find it's not really an exploration of ideas.
No, it's a proof.
It's a carefully constructed proof of a thesis. Western institutions are all portrayed as cowardly or suicidal, so resistance is concentrated in just a few clear-eyed defenders.
That structure means the outcome is a foregone conclusion. The very act of compassion is automatically equated with societal self-destruction.
So if we apply Adler standards for a sound argument, clarity, accuracy, relevance, depth, breadth, the book really struggles.
It struggles massively. It achieves clarity of thesis, for sure, but its depth and breadth are just systematically gutted.
It ignores things.
It ignores or mocks key variables like international law, economic interdependence, any kind of non-racial solidarity. It just reduces a complex global problem to a binary conflict of demographic survival.
And its imaginative power doesn't make up for that misrepresentation.
Not all.
Now, we have to acknowledge that the book's narrative force, even its critics, have recognized its appalling power.
And moments of terrible beauty, some have said, in how it channels that deep cultural anxiety.
But that stylistic power, that potency, is marshaled in service of a worldview that, as we've said, violates the golden rule, treats non-white people as expendable, and depicts equality itself as a fatal delusion.
The book's world actively reinforces anti-democratic and conspiratorial narratives.
So, what is the enduring, challengeable lesson this book proposes? Without giving anything away, it relentlessly suggests that only hard boundaries, backed by a willingness to reject desperate outsiders, can preserve a civilization.
And this is the critical moment for you, the reader. By using the preamble's language of justice and liberty, we can rationally challenge that proposition. Can a civilization worth preserving be built on fear, exclusion, and racial hierarchy? Mindful reading requires you to refuse both the naive denial of migration's complexities and the book's invitation to dehumanize those who suffer.
The challenge of critical thought is always to separate narrative force from moral truth.
Click the link on screen to subscribe, share, purchase via link, and think rationally.
See the many genre-based book podcasts at Mindful Moments. Subscribe and nourish your mind on the go.